Hi, welcome back to my channel, Beautiful Minutia. If you're new here, my name is Tiffany, and today I wanted to recommend some fall short stories to you. These are all short stories that just kind of scream fall to me. They have kind of like a eerie, gothic type of vibe, which just really works for fall for me. Maybe it's too soon to be recommending those because that's probably more of an October vibe. But to me in general, like fall weather, I love like the gothic feel with fall weather. So I have a list of short stories here. Some of them I have multiple short stories for one author, some just one for each author. So I'm going to go ahead and share these with you. So we're going to start out with the master of horror, in my opinion, and that's Edgar Allan Poe. I love him. I have been reading him since I was, I think, like 12 or 13 is when I first started reading Poe, and I have loved him ever since. In fact, I used to borrow my older sister's complete works of Edgar Allan Poe so frequently that one year she gifted it to me for Christmas because she's like, you just need to have this at this point. So last year I actually reread a ton of Edgar Allan Poe short stories with Kelly from Cozy Reader Kelly, and that was really fun. Some of them were rereads for me and some of them were brand new. So I'm going to recommend two Poe short stories to you. The first one is like my favorite short story from when I was a teenager, and that one's The Fall of the House of Usher. This one is just like perfectly creeptastic, although it does have like a bit of a slow start, so just be warned about that. It's about this man who goes and visits his friend and his friend's sister in this big old creepy gothic mansion, and it's a lot of things that happen, but I really don't want to share too much of them because I think it's super easy to spoil short stories. I don't want to do that. But let's just say the ending of this is like very satisfying and very Poe-esque. The second Edgar Allan Poe short story that I want to recommend is one that I read for the very first time last fall because I sure didn't remember it from my teenagers, and I think that I would have. And that's The Facts in the Case of M. Valdemar. This book is really interesting. It's very much based on like hypnotism, and I think it's actually called like mesmerizing in the story. So it's funny because Kelly and I joked that this short story was truly mesmerizing. But it really was so interesting. It was like this almost scientific experiment of what would happen if you did mesmerize or hypnotize someone, and how long would that preserve them, and how long could they stay in that state, and what if you did it with someone who was terminally ill or was about to die. And it was just, it's so interesting, but also very creepy. The end is a tad gruesome, so you've been warned. The next one that I want to recommend is The Yellow Wallpaper, and this is one that I'm actually rereading this month. I have read The Yellow Wallpaper before, but I haven't read the other books in the short story collection that I have, so I'm going to read all of them. But I'm definitely rereading The Yellow Wallpaper because it is really good and very, very gothic. It follows a woman who has been having some mental and emotional issues, and the doctor recommends that the husband take the wife to the sea, which seems like it was like always the solution of doctors way back when, and tells him basically to keep his wife confined to a room. And it's really eerie. You kind of see the wife, well, not kind of, you really see the wife's descent into madness as she's contained in these four walls. And the thing that I found really, really interesting about this story is that it's kind of from experience. The author experienced postpartum depression, and this was the recommendation that her doctor gave her and her husband. And so there's some experiential knowledge that's going into it, which actually makes this that much more eerie to read about. Another very typical story that we think of often when we think of kind of creepy gothic short stories is Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I read this for the first time, I think 2 years ago, and it was so well written. Like, I knew the story, and you probably do too, but in case you don't, I'm not going to tell you. I just feel like Jekyll and Hyde is one of those very like iconic things in our culture. Like, it has greatly influenced our culture, which when you think about it, Robert Louis Stevenson also wrote Treasure Island, and that story greatly shaped how we have pirates portrayed in most movies and stories in America. So I find that very interesting that Robert Louis Stevenson really influenced a lot of our culture, and a lot of the things that he wrote, like, they really have staying power. I think that that's very interesting. So Jekyll and Hyde is no exception to that. And it's just a really well-written story, kind of about the morality of good and evil, in addition to it actually having some really weird and intense moments as well. Next up, I'm going to recommend possibly one of my favorite short story authors of all time, and that's Washington Irving. I think everything that I have read by him, I have absolutely adored, but I'm gonna recommend two stories that seem especially fitting this time of year. The first one is obvious, and that's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And again, this is another one of those works where it's like this has permeated our society, and I feel like lots of people know about the Headless Horseman, and that can become kind of an iconic part of Halloween. But this short story is so much more than just the legends. And I find it so entertaining. The way that Irving writes Ichabod Crane, the protagonist, is so vivid and so funny. Like, Ichabod Crane is so awkward, the way that he behaves and the way that he actually looks, and he does such a great job of communicating that in such a humorous way. So I wouldn't say that overall this story is, oh my gosh, so creepy, as opposed to Poe, because it's really not. I think that movie depictions of Sleepy Hollow are far more creepy than the book is, but I think that the book is definitely still just super fun for this time of year. The other Washington Irving story that I want to recommend is one that I just read last month, and that's The Devil and Tom Walker. This is a Faustian tale where Tom Walker essentially meets the devil in the woods, and he decides he's going to make a deal with the devil to get earthly riches. And as you would imagine, that doesn't pan out well for him in the end. And as pretty much every deal with the devil is, it wasn't worth it. But it's very interesting. Again, there's so much humor, but the writing is very vivid and lush in this forest, and Tom Walker's interactions with his wife are really funny, and there's also some very astute observations. I talked about it quite a bit in my end of the month wrap up for August, so I'll link that in case you want to hear more thoughts. But it is so good, and I feel like it feels very autumnal in the way that nature is portrayed, and so more than just like the Faustian element of it, the book itself feels quite autumnal. Another really great short, and actually very short story is The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. I feel like a lot of people have read this because I've heard a lot of people say it was a required short story reading in high school, but I did not read this until I was an adult. And I want to read more Shirley Jackson because I've also read one of her full-length novels that is super good and is also a great fall recommendation, but I think I'm going to have a fall recommendation video of full-length books. So I'll save that recommendation for that video if I get to it. Hopefully I do. But anyways, The Lottery is very interesting. There's a town and they have a lottery, I think every year, and people are waiting around trying to see who's going to be drawn. And there's definitely like this sense of foreboding, and you don't really know why, and you don't really know what's happening. And that's all that I'm gonna say, because again, it's so easy to spoil short stories, and sometimes spoiling short stories isn't the worst, because short stories, I think, have a lot more to do with idea exploration than they do actually with plot. So for some people, spoiling it wouldn't be a big deal, but I like to go into short stories and regular stories not knowing a whole lot, so I'm not gonna say any more than that. But if you weren't required to read it in high school, I think that you should read it. Another absolute favorite short story author is Flannery OConnor, and I would say that any of Flannery O'Connor's works would work for fall, because she's Southern Gothic and she's definitely got that feel down. Her stories, again, like so many on this list, explore human nature and the depth of those kinds of things, but she has such a way of twisting things at the end, and something always happens that's like devastating at the end that you didn't see coming, even when you know this is Flannery, something's coming. It's often not what you expect at all. And so I could recommend so many of her short stories, but there's one that I feel like really fits the fall vibe the best, even though this is actually not my favorite of her short stories, but I feel like it has that vibe really well, and that's A View of the Woods. And this is about a family. There's a grandfather and his daughter and her husband have moved in with him, and they have children. And he has really bonded with one of the daughters. I think it might be the youngest daughter, because he feels like his granddaughter has the closest personality to him in terms of just being very ruthless and kind of a lookout for number one kind of a person. And so he has always had this idea that he just really wants to get ahead, and so he is trying to sell land around him that has been in his family for a very long time in order to make money and to get ahead and to see progress in their town and in their area, and to be the one to say that he's responsible for it. So it's very much examining his pride in all of that, and then also his hypocrisy, because I feel like hypocrisy is a huge theme in most of Flannery O'Connor's works. And A View of the Woods is no exception to that at all. So I feel like the way that this one ends makes it fit like perfectly in this time of year. And yeah, this one is one that has stuck with me the most. I read her short story collection earlier this year, Everything That Rises Must Converge. And I did a ranking video, so I'll link that in case you want to watch it to see what I thought of each of the stories in that collection, because I absolutely loved them all, except one that was not my favorite, but I loved all the other ones. This one ranked pretty high up there and has continued to be one that I think about. It just started raining, which is quite fitting for this video. So I don't know if you're gonna be able to hear, but it's like pouring. So if you hear background noise, it's the rain. But I have one more author that I'm going to recommend, 2 short stories by this author, and that author is none other than Daphne du Maurier, which is probably not a surprise when you're thinking of gothic, fall vibes kind of stories. She is absolutely a master at this in all of her stories, but her short stories certainly pack a punch. There's a lot of them that I could recommend that are really famous. I think the one that comes to mind the most to people would probably be The Birds, but that was not one of my favorite of her short stories. So I'm going to recommend 2 short stories, one of which is my favorite of hers of all time, and then the second one that is just really fitting for this time of year. So the first one, which is my favorite, is The Apple Tree. And this is about a man who's married and he does not have a happy marriage. And his wife passes away and he buries her under an apple tree, I think. And that's all I'm gonna say, actually. I'm not gonna say more than that. But it's a very good examination into a guilty conscience and all that kind of thing. Like, I don't know, the vibe, not necessarily the storyline, but the vibe reminds me a bit of The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe, which is actually another really great recommendation. But, you know, if you've heard of Poe, like The Telltale Heart is probably one of the first things that pops into your head. So you probably didn't need me to recommend that to you. You probably are already very aware of it, so it's okay. But I feel like The Apple Tree kind of has those same kind of vibes. So if you like those vibes, you'll love The Apple Tree. The second story that I want to recommend by Daphne du Maurier, and actually the last story on this list, is Don't Look Now. This is a story about a husband and wife who have recently lost their daughter, and their son is away at boarding school, I think, and so they go on a trip because they are mourning the loss of their daughter, and it's been very difficult for them. And they come across these 2 sisters, one of whom is blind but claims to be a psychic and able to see the future. And she sees some things that are a little startling and a little confusing, and kind of mess with this couple, and things go from there. And this has been a very memorable short story for me by Daphne du Maurier. I think I have read almost all of her short stories, if not all of them, but this one was one that was just like Oh my goodness. At the end, just some of the things, you see the pieces fitting together, and they did not fit together in the way that I was expecting them to. And du Maurier just does a great job at that. She gets that gothic feel just right. So those are the stories that I have to recommend. Some of them I feel like are very, very famous. And those might even be stories that popped into your head when you saw the title of this video. But hopefully there are a few in here that are hidden gems for you that maybe you haven't tried and that you would like to. I will say as a disclaimer that maybe some of these might be a bit too creepy for you, but I'm a person who can't really stand super scary things. I'm a wimp, and all of these were fine for me, so hopefully they will be for you too. None of them are like Stephen King level because I can't handle that. So they should be kind of like a more low-key fall vibe, if that makes sense. I'd love to hear from you in the comments down below. What do you think of when you think of, you know, fall vibes, gothic kind of short stories? I would love to hear your recommendations down below and see if you have any recommendations that I haven't read yet, because I feel like gothic feel is very well explored in short stories. So I'd love to hear what you think and if you have enjoyed any of the stories that I've recommended. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please hit like and also subscribe so you can continue to see more bookish content from me. Now I will see you again next time.